Have you ever run into a problem where you're trying to talk to somebody and they just don't get it? Or they're so set in what they believe or so firm in what their decision is that you just can't talk to them? They're really stubborn. What happens in real estate? It's the Real Estate Show. Welcome to the Real Estate Show. My name is Rick Naples. I am the owner-broker of Zone Realty LLC. You zone your home. I opened up the show talking about, well, for lack of better words, stubborn people. You know, when you're negotiating on a real estate deal, there are a lot of people that are involved in that negotiation. Of course, you have the seller who's selling the home, and you have the buyer that's buying the home. Then you have, of course, the realtor that's representing the seller, their listing agency, the realtor that's representing the buyer. You have the attorneys for both sides. You have home inspectors and inspectors that do other kinds of inspections. You have the bank and the appraiser and the mortgage underwriter and the mortgage officer. There's a lot of people that are involved in order to make a real estate transaction come together. It's actually a small miracle when you come to think of it, because you have people from different careers, different backgrounds, different belief systems, different goals, all trying to get on the same page to get to the closing for that deal to happen, right? So I talked on a previous real estate show about renegotiating. You purchased the home, you've found some issues, you're renegotiating, and so on and so forth. But what happens when you get one in the group of all those people that are involved to make the sale happen not be cooperative? And it could go sideways a number of different ways. You can have a seller that just does not want to hear nothing. Here's what I'm offering you. Here's the price you offered me. That's it. I don't want to talk about it. It's that, my way or the highway. Done. You have the buyers. I want this. I want that. You know, you're going to do this. You change that. You pay for this. You fix that. Otherwise, I'm not buying the home, and I don't want to talk about it. You could have the appraiser who says, this is what I found. This is the comparables. I'm sticking by it. This is what the house appraises for, and I'm not going to change the appraisal. I'm sorry it's not your expectation, but that's the way it is. I don't want to talk about it. You can even have attorneys sometimes have disagreements between each other. Could be an underwriting issue, or the underwriter that's putting together the mortgage says, well, this isn't good enough, Mr. Buyer. I need this. I need that. You got to give me this. And, you know. And this is just the way it is. It's written in stone. We can't change it. Real estate and the transaction is a negotiation. It is a thing of gives and takes. It is a thing of everybody getting what they want. So you have to be open-minded as you're going along. If you have somebody that draws a line in the sand and says to you, this is what I'm going to do and I'm not going to do anything else, you have to try to look at why they're being like that. Now, perhaps if no one's going to budge, the deal's just not going to happen. It's going to fall apart. There could be surprises that come up where neither party was prepared to negotiate on that particular item, and no one wants to really deal with it. I've told the story on the real estate show about a situation where a few years back I was selling a multi-family home. Multi-family homes, folks, that's a whole That's a whole different challenge as opposed to a regular single residential home. Now you're dealing with a number of units. You could be dealing with tenants. You can be dealing with 3 or 4 times everything you got to look at. So that becomes a different type of challenge. But in this particular situation, what had happened was everything was fine and great and wonderful and negotiated and whatever. And it turned out that when we got to the actual closing table, we're all sitting around the table that day, getting ready to close on this deal, that it was found out that one of the tenants in the building had not paid their rent for a number of months, and that the seller was starting the eviction process. The buyer said, I'm not closing on this home until that tenant is evicted. The seller said, well, evictions take time. That's not going to happen, and we need to close on the home today. It was a very tough situation. The attorneys got involved, and they figured out ways they were going to escrow money and protect the rent and do this and do that. But the buyer dug their head in the sand and said, we're not buying a home where a tenant is currently under eviction. We don't want it. And they walked away from the closing table. Literally got up from the closing table and left, refusing to buy the home. The seller was dumbstruck because the seller was willing to negotiate, actually put up to a year's worth of rental money into an escrow account, so that the buyer, if they purchased the home, was guaranteed getting the rental income on that unit until the tenant was put out. The buyer was concerned that the tenant was going to go all out and starts bashing holes in walls and making all kinds of destruction and so on and so forth. That's happened sometimes, maybe it doesn't happen. But again, it was an impasse. The buyer refused, although there was a renegotiation and there was an option to solve the issue. The buyer refused to be flexible and they walked away from the deal. Those things happen. Sometimes it's the seller's side. The seller will say, I agreed to sell my home for XYZ. You agreed to buy my home for XYZ. I don't want to know nothing. This is what the deal is. You take it or you leave it. This is where I mentioned on a previous real estate show, you have to be careful about good faith money, escrow monies, and so on and so forth. Because if the deal falls apart and the seller's making the deal fall apart because they don't want to renegotiate on anything, and the buyer decides to walk away because they won't renegotiate on an issue that's important to renegotiate on, sometimes that escrow money comes into play. This is why we get attorneys involved, because if it gets to a certain stage within the transaction, the attorneys have to get together and start this renegotiation to kind of be that third party, to be able to take the stubborn side, whether it's the seller or the buyer, and explain to them, here are the risks, here are the options that can make this deal move forward, to kind of get them on the same page. Now, I've had deals blow up because of inspections. I talked on a previous real estate show about home inspections. Sometimes things come up during the inspections that have to be renegotiated on, right? And the inspector puts in the inspection report, this has to be done. Sometimes that comes up with, I'll use the example of the roof on the house. Let's say the inspector looks at the roof, and the roof on the house is 30 years old, 40 years old, and they make the recommendation that the roof is showing signs of wear, maybe there's a leak somewhere, and it's saying that that roof has to be replaced. The seller gets the request from the buyer that the buyer wants a new roof put on the house before they'll close, and the seller says, nope, not going to happen, can't afford it, ain't going to do it, I'm selling the house as is. You offered this money, it's your responsibility, I don't want to talk about it, XYZ, so on and so forth. This sometimes is where the realtors get together and they start talking about seeing if they can massage the deal a little bit. They talk to the attorneys talk to see if there's some way of maybe changing the price that was offered on the house or getting some kind of incentive going in order to make the buyer feel comfortable moving forward, knowing they're going to have to put a new roof on the house right away. Could be an as-is purchase where the buyer's buying the home knowing they're going to have to do that, and then it's a moot point. But again, how do you get around a situation where you have people involved in a transaction that just won't renegotiate or move, that won't come to the table? Now, I'm going to be fair here. Sometimes the realtors are the issue. Yeah, I said it. The realtors are the issue. What do I mean by that? Realtors are compensated only when a property closes. They want to be paid, right? You go to work every day, you go to a job, you get an agreed amount of salary or hourly wage. This is what you've agreed to do this job to get paid. Realtors sign a contract with the seller or with their buyer, and they negotiate what they're going to be compensated. And that compensation is based on the deal closing at XYZ amount of price. What if a renegotiation is done and the price is not the price that the realtor was going to be compensated on? In other words, the price has been lowered, it's been changed. The realtor is going to make less on the deal because it's been renegotiated. What if the realtor says, you agreed by contractual agreement to pay me XYZ based on the purchase price of the home at the time we made the offer, not on the renegotiated price. And they're not willing to change their compensation. I relate this to, let's say you work for XYZ amount of dollars per year. You have a regular full-time job, and this is what you work for. This is what you get compensated. And you walk into work one day after a specifically hard month, and your boss says to you, great job, you've done a wonderful job, everything's wonderful, but I'll tell you what, I'm going to cut your pay by this much. But I expect you to do the same job. In fact, I expect you to do even more, work harder for less money. Well, what do you do? Do you accept that? Do you fight? Do you go on strike? What do you do? What happens? Realtors are compensated based on deals closing. They will negotiate right up front what they're going to be compensated for, right at the time that you agree to hire them. It's just like when you hire a tradesperson. You hire a plumber, the plumber says, here's what the job's going to cost, and that's what you expect to pay, correct? Sometimes the job gets more involved, they cost more, so a lot of times when a contract is written, there is a negotiation clause in that contract that will say, here's what happens if this happens. Here's what I agree to be compensated for if this happens. When the National Association of Realtors made its agreement in the civil lawsuit that happened about compensating agreements between realtors, it's no longer disclosed to the realtor what they're going to be paid if they help a buyer buy a certain seller's house, because the sellers no longer have that obligation to offer compensation to the buyer representation. The buyer now has to negotiate, or the buyer rep has to now negotiate what they're going to be compensated with their buyer and how that's going to work, either in the offering agreement or directly from the buyer, whatever it's going to be. There is a contract. So sometimes deals can go sideways because the realtors can't get on the same page. But I'm going to tell you this. Most realtors, and I include myself in this group, are realtors because they've agreed to live by a higher code of ethics. They've agreed that their fiduciary responsibility is to the persons or persons they are representing. So they're not going to put a deal in jeopardy because of compensation. There are some people out there that might do that. Well, perfect example is, you have an electrician that quotes a certain price on something, and then they come to the house and they tell you, well, this is going to cost a lot more, it's going to be this. You always have that option to say, well, I'll find somebody else, thank you very much, and not go forward with the job. I will say you will always get things in writing. This is what contracts are all about. It tells you exactly what the compensation is going to be and how that compensation is paid and when it's paid and what the amount's going to be. So you know that going forth. The realtor will make adjustments if they have to. Sometimes it happens where the attorneys have issues as far as how they're compensated, and you may have to renegotiate with them. Attorneys have a flat fee for closings. Here's where the closing's involved, but maybe more gets involved in that closing because it's strange. There's extra work they have to do. Their contract with the buyer, with the seller, will also explain what their ins and outs are or what they have. The main problem for deals to fall apart is between the sellers and the buyers. Not so much the home inspectors, the appraisers, the realtors, or whatever. They're all professionals. They all have agreements. They all have scenarios on how to get compensated on agreed fees that are spelled right out and what happens in this. It's the unknowns that cause the issues. It's the seller that says, I'm not going to renegotiate. It's the buyer that says, renegotiate or I'm walking away. Those are when the problems really start to happen. And sometimes that's when the realtors on both sides have to become the renegotiators to try and compensate or make the deal happen or help the deal happen by giving agreements to the buyer or to the seller in order to move the deal forward. I think our industry as realtors is the only industry where, because of the fiduciary responsibilities and the code of ethics, realtors may give up their livelihood, their income, in order to help a deal move forward. In other words, they'll take less of a paycheck. I'd like to see anyone that goes into work in a regular type of job that's not commission-based, that will say to their boss, hey, this week I'll work for half of what I normally work for, because I'm a great guy. Because I want you to be successful, I'll work for half of what I normally work for. I'd like to see someone who works hourly say, I'm going to go to work today and I'm going to tell my boss I'll work twice as many hours for half the pay, just because I want to help their business succeed. Can it happen? I don't know. I've never seen it happen. Maybe it does happen. I don't know. The only ones that I ever see invest in doing something like that is usually the owner of the company. You're running a restaurant. You got to go without a paycheck for a while. You need the restaurant to be successful. Maybe that's what you do. Same thing with retail. I've seen it happen in real estate. I'm not going to say realtors will work for nothing. Everybody has to be compensated for their work. But sometimes you'll get people that are just so stubborn, so set, they won't open their eyes and they won't be willing to negotiate. And usually that stubbornness basically means there's something underlying behind that you need to uncover. Why are they being so stubborn? Why are they putting their head in the sand? If it's a seller that's refusing to renegotiate on something, there's a good possibility they already knew that problem existed and they failed to disclose it to the potential buyer that's looking to buy the home. And that can be a problem within itself. Maybe they don't want to renegotiate because they knew that problem existed and they got the offer and they figured the buyer's the sucker, the buyer's going to buy the house and let them deal with it. That has to be uncovered, because if that's the case, now you have a whole nother reason to try to renegotiate the deal. Sometimes the buyer, in the zealousness to get the home, offers more than the asking price and offers up and above what they might be capable of paying. And then they'll say, well, I can't do this amount. I know I won the contract and I know I said I was going to, but I can't do it anymore. Things have changed. I got to offer only this. That could be a big problem too. Sometimes the buyers get a little overwhelmed with something that comes up with the inspection report. And they say, unless you fix this, I'm not moving forward with the deal. They can make issues over the simplest things. I'll tell another quick story here. I had a deal that went perfect. Everything was fine and great and wonderful. When it got to the closing table, before we went, we did our walkthrough. And I told you what a walkthrough was all about, when the buyer gets to go through the house and make sure everything needs to be agreed. And we went to the home, and the washer and dryer were no longer there. The property inclusion report, which is the form that everybody signs, said the washer and the dryer are included in the deal and convey with the house. But at the last minute, the seller decided to take the washer and dryer to their new home. The buyer was very upset because the buyer said the washer and dryer were supposed to stay with the house. I'm not prepared to have to buy a new washer and dryer. So at the closing table, they said, we had an agreement, the washer and dryer were supposed to stay, you took the washer and dryer, you owe me a washing and drying machine. The seller said, no, it was my property, I took it. Well, there was a contract that said it was being conveyed with the house. It was part of the purchase price of the house. So because that was not part of the purchase of the house, the attorneys had to negotiate a credit so that the buyer would have the ability to purchase a new washer and dryer. Long story short, the deal did come together. It actually involved several parties kicking in money in order to get that washer and dryer, but it was totally unnecessary. I mean, when you as a seller sign your listing agreement and you agree that certain things are going to convey with the sale of the house, you can't at the last minute decide, well, I'm going to take my refrigerator, or I'm going to take my washer and dryer, or whatever it might be. If you've said this is conveying with the sale of the house, it stays. It's part of the contract. If you take it, now you put yourself in a vulnerable situation where you're going to have to renegotiate. The buyer has certain expectations when they're purchasing the property, and those expectations have to be met. We agreed to this is what it's got to be. We said that that was going to stay, that's got to be there. Never, as a buyer, purchase a home and not take that opportunity to do that final walkthrough. You want to make sure that the home, first of all, is still there, it hasn't burnt down. I've had that happen before, quite honestly. That everything that you're buying is supposed to be there. Bring your contract with you. Bring the inclusion report with you. Bring the home inspection report with you when you're doing that walkthrough. And check everything. No, you're not going to negotiate because a light bulb burnt out, at the last minute. Go buy a light bulb, No, you're not going to renegotiate because the house is now empty and you see that the house is a little dirtier. Even though the contract says the home is conveying in broom swept clean condition, sometimes sellers don't clean. The house is a mess. I've had houses that are spotless, beautifully, they had it professionally cleaned. And the buyer comes in and says, wow. And what's the first thing the buyer does when they move into the house? It's natural. We all clean, right? We clean the toilet. We wash the sinks, right? We just do it. Even though it's already been done. Because we're just doing it for our own peace of mind, right? So certain things you can't renegotiate on, or you shouldn't renegotiate on. Your realtor is going to tell you that. So when you end up in a situation where the seller, the buyer, the home inspector, the appraiser, or any of the people that are involved in the transaction make the deal start to go sideways, remember, there's always a way to find common ground to make the deal move forward. And as my father used to say, if it doesn't move forward, then maybe it was never meant to be. My name is Rick Naples, and I thank you very much for watching the Real Estate Show. Stay tuned for another show concerning problems and concerns in a real estate transaction. See you next time.
Nick Augustino right here at the East Side Restaurant. We always have the complete full dinner menu. Knockwurst, bratwurst, sauerbraten, potato pancakes, red cabbage, rice pudding, cream pies, all the desserts that Germany had to offer. I always do something different. Yes, I do. I brought seafood to the beer garden at the East Side Restaurant. East Side Restaurant, your German destination restaurant in Connecticut. Tiki-taka, hoy, hoy, hoy!